Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're coming from. Thanks for joining us for the session on Palaeoart Modeling Ancient Life, or if you have been with us throughout the day, thanks for sticking around for this final session of the day, but not the final session of the conference. My name is Sascha Priewe, and I work at the Royal Ontario Museum. And I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which sits on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, are home to many diverse First Nations. I also wish to acknowledge that this territory is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd like to thank the colleagues at the University of Birmingham, the Oxford Museum Conference together, and for organizing this next outing of our Symbiosis network. Run the talks in roughly chronological order, and please, as you heard, place the questions in the chat, and I will get to them at the end of. Begin with Elaine Charwat, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of London and at the Oxford
Just to say, Sascha, your microphone, we're getting the sound in and out. So if you could possibly maybe try another microphone while Elaine's speaking, we'll give it another go. But I'll start Elaine's slides up now.
Oh, excellent. There they are. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for inviting me. And well, this eclectic overview of historical 3D material models and modeling of extinct organisms is informed by my own research project, and it's therefore a personal take. It touches on the relationship between art and science, but also on the question of what can be classified as a model, the accuracy of models, as well as the interdisciplinary nature, especially the relationship between paleontology and zoology. Scientific modeling of extinct organisms did not begin in earnest until the 19th century. Material manifestations of reconstructed or reimagined life were largely dependent on a chronological understanding of the world instead of a perfect great chain of being or even Lamarck's ladder of complexity. An emphasis on the rare and the wonderful with regard to nature and natural history collections gradually morphed into a more encyclopedic approach and onto the timelines, the narratives of development and change that we now take for granted. So here we can see Ole Worm's collection in Copenhagen depicted in 1655, and there's indeed a now extinct organism visible. This bird here is quite probably a stuffed great auk. It became extinct in the mid-19th century. While this is a straightforward zoological taxidermy model because great auk specimens were rare but still available at that point, attempts were and still are made to use taxidermy materials and techniques to reconstruct extinct animals from fossil remains. One of the early ancestors of modern birds was discovered in 1860-61. The Archaeopteryx was discussed as direct proof of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. Not only was especially the iconic Berlin specimen reproduced countless times and widely distributed in 3D through casts, it was also modeled in 3D, for example, to understand the structure and development of wings. At the Department of Comparative Anatomy at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, E. Ray Lancaster's assistant William Plain Pycraft created a taxidermy model of the Archaeopteryx wing. In his 1894 paper, The Wing of the Archaeopteryx, he gives a detailed account of his research and techniques for producing the model in-house. He states that Professor E. Ray Lancaster desired me to make a model of the wing to be exhibited in the museum. But as Pycraft conducted important research in the process of producing the model, which was subsequently published, the model was much more than just for display. And here we can also see a modern version of this approach. Richard Hammond's model of the Archaeopteryx in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, created in the 1990s, again using actual bird feathers. Fossils were known before the 19th century, but usually not in a sense we would recognize today, although individual naturalists such as Robert Hooke in 1694 contemplated the possibility of extinction. But it took long to turn the tide. Concepts of deep pair time were becoming established, although often fiercely contested through advances in geology and physics by the 19th century. Species of foraminifera and radiolarian are marine microorganisms that may be found as fossils dating from Cambrian times right up to living specimens today. Thousands of fossil specimens were brought back from deep-sea explorations, such as the Challenger expedition in 1873 to 1876, and caused huge interest. However, they had two big disadvantages: their unwieldy taxonomy and their size. As microorganisms, they were difficult to examine and display. So models stepped in, representing these organisms in ways illustrations could not. However, reality is not so simple. Haeckel noted in his Radiolaria collected by the HMS Challenger their aberrant and strange form. Models often simplified and standardized aberrant forms encountered, focusing on the most prominent characteristics believed to be essential for classifying them. Václav Fritsch was a natural history dealer in Prague, and together with his brother Antonín, curator of the zoology and paleontology collections at the Natural History Museum in Prague, he developed a series of plaster of Paris models of foraminifera, as well as papier-mâché models of radiolaria. The brothers worked closely with Ernst Haeckel, on whose illustrations the models were based. With a better understanding of fossils started the attempts to reconstruct extinct organisms in 3D. Although actual bones were often used partially or for the entire reconstruction, these ossiferous models were often wild guesses as to what the organisms would have looked like, imaginatively filling gaps in the fossil record and producing some unlikely or even completely fictional anatomies, which changed with more bones being found and more knowledge becoming available. Richard Owen, the discoverer of dinosaurs, worked closely with the sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins to create life-size models of dinosaurs sculpted in concrete using a metal frame. They were to be exhibited in the area surrounding the newly relocated Crystal Palace in Sydenham, opening to the public in 1854. The dinosaurs caused a sensation and spawned countless reproductions and imitations all across Europe. An example would be the tabletop model of the dinosaurs created by Arthur Eloff in Paris. Reconstructions involving original bones, often mixing bones from different specimens, casts, or purely sculpted reconstructions, became the field and a laboratory to collect and test data, to develop theories, or to disprove them. Even before Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, comparative anatomy and morphology was employed to figure out how organisms were related to each other, mainly for taxonomic reasons. But this vastly accelerated in the second half of the 19th century, when things like common ancestors were the price of inquiry. Embryonic or larval development as the key to an organism's evolutionary history, its phylogeny, was, for instance, championed by Ernst Haeckel. As the instruments of anatomical observation, especially microscopes, became ever more sophisticated, so became the need for models to literally grasp minute and complex anatomical structures. A 3D standard was established, preparing students in great magnification and sometimes simplification for what to see when using a microscope. Embryologists, anatomists, or morphologists would often work closely with professional scientific modelers, such as the Zieglers in Freiburg, Germany. Models of primordial features, ancestral features observable in the development of animals today became part of scientific controversies and discoveries. The ancestors of vertebrates were a major line of inquiry, but also speculative early ancestors of multicellular organisms, such as the Gastrea, which Haeckel deduced from embryonic stages of primitive, what he called primitive vertebrates. Anatomical wax models, through their production techniques, oscillated between near casts and visualizing ideas rather than material reality. They also oscillated between freehand artistic modeling of an original and exact replication. Wilhelm Hies played a hugely important role in anatomical modeling. He was appointed professor of anatomy at the University of Leipzig in 1872. He introduced equipment to mechanize the production of anatomical preparations and models with his improved version of the microtome, a section cutter, which he described in 1870, as well as an embryograph to draw outlines of sections onto wax plates. This made it possible to give body to visual understanding. The drive for increasing mechanization towards the end of the 19th century in the life sciences and in scientific modeling gathered pace. Gustav Born's Plattenmodelliermethode worked by tracing details of individual sections onto wax plates, and then stacking the plates to create a model of previously unachieved and unachievable exactitude. It did away with the need for free modeling and could therefore claim to be more mechanized, even more objective, comparing to previous methods, almost like a photograph would compare to a drawing. Models could now be solely made by the anatomist and only given to a modeler for finishing and distribution. As Hopwood confirms, it was not until the mid-1880s that many scientists began themselves to model. At the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, plate wax models were increasingly produced in-house, often by students as part of their lab work by the turn of the century. These new mechanized methods were also utilized for fossils. William Sollas was professor of geology at Oxford from 1897 to 1936. He further developed this technique for creating upscaled models, essentially using destructive serial sectioning of fossils. Specimens were ground down in fraction of millimeter thin successive slices and photographed and drawn as the surfaces and structure were revealed. Each section was reproduced on a wax plate, and it was possible to achieve exact upscaling and then recreating the fossil in 3D. So as we can see, models tended to fall into two categories: for educating and entertaining the public, for display, or models for scientific research, publishing, and teaching. But, of course, this was not always clear-cut and still isn't today. But one thing is obvious to me. Material models are part of the field, the lab. They are part of generating knowledge in paleontology and zoology. They are important objects that record the processes behind collections, institutions, and science, information that is often not recorded elsewhere. They are not ephemeral to museum collections. They are part of their core data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I'm not sure if that is any better. I'm going closer to the mic. I have trouble signing on to another machine, which seems to be abandoning right just now. Next up, we have Esben Horn, who is the founder of 10 Tons, a company that makes zoological and botanical models and paleontological reconstructions. Please join me in welcoming Esben.
Esben, can you turn your camera and microphone on using the two buttons on the left-hand side at the top of the page?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay,
Take it
good.
away.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Esben Horn. I was born in 1966, and this means that I was a kid long before Jurassic Park movie hit the big screens. And back then, dinosaurs were for nerds. You couldn't buy any toys in Denmark. You could hardly get any books about dinosaurs or prehistory. So my father had shipped books over from the UK, and he translated them for me. And I was crazy about trilobites and placoderms, and dinosaurs and hominids. I remember that Stenic Burian was my entrance to prehistory. Back then, I wasn't sculpting, but I was drawing all the time, making drawings of the fantastic creatures. And basically, I just continued, and this is the reason why I'm doing this of true passion, because I'm just crazy about prehistory. Today, I have a company called 10 Tons, and I have a core team of 3 brilliant craftsmen. I have Rasmus Frederiksen, who is making molds and casting. Dimitro Teslenko, who's one of the best digital sculptors on this planet, and Stacy Week, who's all over the workshop, brilliant at all kinds of tasks, from digital sculpting to painting and finishing our models. We have a workshop at the Copenhagen Harbor, and we have been around for 23 years. And we have made more than 100 species of present and prehistoric creatures. And we can be seen on 40 museums on 3 continents. We have won 2 Lansdorf National Geographic Palaeoart prizes, one in 2017 for this Archaeopteryx, and one in 2009 for this Dunkleosteros model. As I'm not a paleontologist, we are totally dependent on scientists to help us make a correct reconstruction. So when we get a job, we start to collect as many papers and pictures about this species as possible. And then we start to sculpt digitally. And when the scientist is happy about all the details, the anatomy, we will 3D print or robot mill the model, or do both depending on the size of the model. When it comes to this, something happened. Sorry about this. When it comes to this 7.7 meter plateausaur, we had the body robot milled in styrofoam, and the head and the feet and the forelimbs were 3D printed. We covered the body with a compound called rashmonite that was invented by our own lab rat Rasmus. It's a non-toxic, cheap acrylic gypsum compound that turns rock hard and is brilliant to sculpt from. In this case, we also built a small diorama for the Natural History Museum in Zurich that's behind the plateausaur. We use more or less the same techniques when we made a handful of huge dinosaurs for Natur Bornholm in Denmark, but just without 3D printed elements. Back then, it was out of question to have bigger elements 3D printed. But the technology is developing very fast. So now we are, at the moment, we are working on an Ambulocetus on 3 meters that are 3D printed. We are also working on an Archelon, 4 meters, flippers, and the soft parts, heads, flippers are 3D printed. And even though it's SLA, that's the very fine 3D print with almost invisible layering, we are spraying a very thin layer of artificial clay onto the print just to be sure there's no sign of 3D printing left. The shield was robot milled from styrofoam, and we covered it again with rashmonite. And we are painting with brushes and airbrushes with acrylic paints. I've always thought that Dunkleosteros was the coolest creature on Earth ever. And the first one that we made was 2 meters long, and now we had the chance to make a 6 meter long version. The head and the fins were 3D printed again, and the body was robot milled from styrofoam. We have been experimenting with different techniques to make feathers and proto-feathers and dinosaurs. This Sinosauropteryx was covered with flocking. It's a technique where we transfer fibers to the surface with static electricity. And this little guy is a very small model, 20 centimeters. We covered it with glue and just laid, so to speak, the hairs on it. And this Megalodon, we punched the hairs in one at a time to the head, and the body was covered with a stretchable artificial custom-made fur from National Fibers in the States. This one was sculpted digitally, and we made a smaller core. We removed the outer surface, and this core we had flocked again with so it was covered with fur. Then we put it back into the mold and embedded it in the resin. And this way we got this very fluffy bird-like look that we couldn't have achieved by just painting it. Here we have a fake amber, piece of amber we made for the cover of Geology Today. It was for an article by Mats E. Eriksson about fake amber. I have one more passion beside paleontology, and that's heavy metal music. And I succeeded in combining these two interests in a traveling exhibition called Rock Fossils on Tour. We had Joe Petagno, who made most of the Motorhead's covers just to get the right rock feel. The exhibition shows models of fossils named after rock stars, and since 2013 it has been traveling through Europe and has been on display 13 times. At the moment it's in Maastricht in Holland, and we have the gig number 14 in Osnabrück early next year. This is a marine snail from Eocene named after Ronnie James Dio. We sculpted it digitally. We made the soft parts, the inner core, and we made the outer surface. And when we made the casting of these parts, first we made the inner core, painted it, and then we put it into the mold of the outer surface. So you have this subsurface scattering where you can see there's organs inside the outer mold. Here we have a brittle star, Jurassic brittle star, named after a Swedish metal band Arch Enemy. And again, we had this inner core embedded in a nail-colored resin to give it subsurface scattering. And the arms are actually cast in straight position, and then we can heat bend them in position afterwards. And here's art meets science, where we have this heavy metal trophy handed over on stage to the singer of Arch Enemy. Here's another example of art meets black metal. It's Sakis Toulis, who had a brittle star named after him from the band Russian Christ. Here we have a huge bristleworm that we made from black leather. It's just about 2-3 meters high, as a gigantic displays for this exhibition. Here's a trilobite, 2 meter long, trilobite named after Sid Vicious. And we had some small wheelie bug-like trilobites as youngsters for the exhibition. And finally, art meets science, meet the crowd at its Rock Fossils on Tour at the Sweden Rock Festival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esben. Please don't forget to post any questions in the chat. We'll pick up on them after, unless they've already been answered in the chat. Next up is Duncan Murdock, who's the collections manager of the Earth collections at the Oxford Museum of Natural History. Hey, Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. So I'm the collections manager at the Oxford University Museum, but previously I was a research fellow working on some of the fossils from the very first animals that we know about in the fossil record. And as part of that, I was part of the team that put together an exhibition which was recently closed called First Animals. It was bringing together the story of the origin of animal life. So just a quick plug before I carry on. The digital legacy of the First Animals exhibition is available online now, so you can go to this the web address there. I think the link might pop up in the chat as well, if you want to find out more about this exhibition, both from the perspective of the Palaeoart, but also the science. So very briefly then, this the First Animals exhibition covered this, I think, is the most exciting and interesting part of Earth history, where we see this dramatic change from ecosystems dominated by these weird and wonderful creatures that we're only now starting to be able to place on the animal tree of life in a period known as the Ediacaran, into the Cambrian, where we see all of the different kinds of modern organisms appear. They're still weird and wonderful creatures in and of themselves, but we can very much more confidently place those in the modern animal tree. And it's this transition that we were focusing on in this exhibition. Now, the challenge with these sorts of animals is a lot of their anatomy is very, very strange. So we needed a way to get this across to the public, and we worked with a company called Mighty Fossils that do 3D reconstructions, digital reconstructions of modern and extinct organisms. And along with the design team and also the public engagement team in the museum and the designers Easy Tiger Collective, these reconstructions really became the heart of the sort of visual identity of the exhibition. So hopefully you can see here we've got everything from big banners to the actual displays themselves, the displays containing the fossils, and a digital interactive that I'll come back to in a moment. And of course, also the merchandise. So here we have some Christmas decorations, Cambrian critters that you can hang in your Christmas tree. This is my tree from last Christmas. And I also gave one of these to each of my bemused relatives to hang in their trees as well. So the asset that we gained from making these reconstructions we used in lots and lots of different ways. So the challenge with these fossils is they are in and of themselves visually striking and beautiful, but very difficult to understand. And that's partly because of what makes them so important, is that they preserve the soft parts of the animals that normally don't make their way into the fossil record. So things like skin and eyes and muscles, perhaps even nervous tissues, guts, all sorts of different parts of the animal that we don't normally see. And secondly, they are by and large completely flattened. So you have we want to try and make a three-dimensional reconstruction of the animal as it was from a completely 2D fossil. And it's also worth noting that these aren't sort of flowers pressed in a book. We've lost an awful lot of information too. So the anatomy has decayed away or has been disrupted or deformed in the processes that preserve these fossils. And so we have an awful lot to do in between going from the imaging the fossil itself to the 3D reconstruction. So I wanted to talk to you from the perspective of a researcher, how we worked with the artist to produce these 3D reconstructions and then what we did with them. And so we started off with some existing drawings of what different researchers thought these creatures might have looked like, and worked with Martin Lysek at Mighty Fossils, a sort of iterative process, building these sort of simple box models of these organisms. So in this case, this is an extinct walking worm called Onychodictium, and we took part in a series of back and forth discussions, modifying these models progressively. So here you can see we wanted slightly different shape to these extensions on the body and a different ending to the posterior part of the animal. So we went through a whole series of minor improvements until we got to these 3D models that we could then move forward with. Another challenge, of course, is what color to give to these creatures. So with some, we could use modern relatives. So in this case, these extinct animals are relatives of modern velvet worms. So that's these. Today they live in tropical leaf litter, but they come in a whole array of different colors. But we were able to give these photographs of modern relatives to Martin Lysek at Mighty Fossils to develop a sort of color palette for the whole reconstruction. And we ended up with something that looks like this. So this is one of a series of models that we made. So it's a mixture of artistic license and as much of the science as we could get. So we were aiming to get as scientifically accurate models as possible. So for some of the other animals that we looked at, we also wanted to try and get some ecological information. So this is this animal called Plectobelua. It's thought to be one of the first larger predators of the Cambrian seas. So we used as a model in the top right above my head, this is the peacock mantis shrimp, which is thought to be somewhat related to Plectobelua in the modern. And we used that as a model to try and get the color palette. But we also wanted to, we know that the ecology of Plectobelua is not like that of the peacock mantis shrimp. It's much more of like a free swimming predator, something like this reef shark just right next to me in this on the screen. So we used the counter shading that you see in modern predators like the shark. So we have this light underside and darker top surface to this Plectobelua to try and put these animals in their ecological context as well. So in all we made 19 3D models, and now these are all available on Sketchfab. They're free to download. So we've already had over 120,000 visits to this Sketchfab collection, which you can all have a look at. The link is in the chat. And we've had over nearly 1,700 downloads of these models. So there's a lot that you can do with them. And very recently, I was sent a link to an interactive game that somebody's developing using some of these models. So they are publicly available. You can, of course, also download them. And if you get the Sketchfab app, you can place these animals in your living room. Here is an Plectobelua much enlarged, skulking its way through the museum. But you can have them swimming in your own bathroom or swimming along with you on your way to work. And you can also 3D print these models. They're available. So these are some prints that were made by our own Jack Matthews of some of the organisms in this display. So all of these models are available for non-commercial purposes. So once we've got the organisms themselves, we wanted to put them in an environment where they were able to interact with each other and also with the sea floor. So we start off with a simple sheet-like sea bottom, and then we can add textures, and we were trying to get across using what we know from the rocks themselves to try and reconstruct what we thought the sediments were like. So this is this sort of gloopy, muddy sea floor, and then we're able to add particulate matter in the water column as well to create a complete 3D environment for these animals to live in. So in the end, we produced 3 dioramas as still images. So there's this one here which represents the sort of precursor to this big explosive event that we call the Cambrian explosion, with some of the very first animals based on some amazing fossil sites in Newfoundland, Canada. So we have this dark, gloomy environment. We know this environment was below the water depths at which light can penetrate, with these strange animals occupying this environment. Then we move forward around 20 million years and we start to see a bigger diversity of different creatures. You can see some what would eventually become trace fossils occupying the interacting with the sediment, and we've got we've got shallower environments. So we've got the interaction with photosynthetic organisms as well. And then finally we had our reconstruction of the main site that was the focus of the latter part of the exhibition, is the Xinjiang biota in Yunnan province of China in the Middle Cambrian, where we had a whole host of organisms interacting with each other. But we didn't just want to make a still piece of art. We wanted to have a 3D environment, and we also wanted to animate these creatures and see how they would move and how they might interact with each other. So if I can have the first video. So we produced this video is available on YouTube. Also on YouTube, there's an interactive version of this where you can move around the space. And so we worked with the animators at Mighty Fossils, and you can also hear the sort of marine noise that we added to try and make this as immersive as possible. So we've got this walking worm on a connecting crawling its way in the foreground. We've got organisms that are fixed to the sea floor. Hopefully you can see these little worms popping up out of their burrows periodically, and this is based on direct evidence of trace fossils from the fossil site. And also we have creatures swimming through the water column as well. So here a Betula cola, and in the background there's these early vertebrates, these fish, Melacamingia. And every now and again, the predator will swoop through Amplexibulua that will interacts with the rest of the environment. So if you want to see more of this video, as I say, it's available on YouTube and the links in the chat. We can go back to the slides, if that's possible. And then finally, the other installation that we placed in the exhibition was a 3D immersive interactive that we called the Cambrian Diver. So we had some so here this is my youngest having a go at driving this little submersible. So we had these 3 screens that replicated the windows of a submersible craft, and you were able to interact and learn more about the exhibition and the organisms in it. So if I could have the last video. And you'll hopefully see one of our exhibition team actually interacting with this. So we were able to build this 3D environment and then put that into a game engine that you could interact with. You could choose which animal you wanted to focus on and drive the submersible and find out more about those creatures and their modern relatives and their ecological role. And all of this was built on these 3D reconstructions that were made with Mighty Fossils. So as I said at the start, they really became an integral part of the exhibition as a whole. And this, I think, is at the end there you can see one of my favorite parts. We had the trilobites actually feeding on the dead Amplexibulua to try and complete that sort of ecological loop. And so I'll leave you with, this is my favorite animal that we worked on. This is one of our relatives, Melacamingia, that we, this is an early fish that we were able to bring in what we know about the fossils themselves and some research that I'd done myself, and also comparing it to its modern relatives. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I have a few questions myself, but let's begin with a couple of questions from the chat. And maybe we'll start with you, Duncan. Susan Newell is saying that it is right to say that the act of interpreting the signs for the public contributed to the furthering of knowledge about these organisms.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had to answer questions that we didn't necessarily know the answer to, and so there's lots of missing information. So it did actually prompt re-examining of some of the material. So that's absolutely right, that there's this back and forth between the researchers, and we talked to a whole host of other researchers that have specialisms in different areas. So and then going forwards, we're using some of these 3D models. So a colleague in the museum, Dr. Imran Rahman, is leading a project that's using these 3D models and artificially or digitally putting them in a flume tank and trying to understand how they would have interacted with the environment. So yeah, so there's a scientific legacy as well as a sort of artistic legacy. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
May follow up quickly. As you may know, Duncan, at the Royal Ontario Museum, we're currently building the Wilna Madge Gallery, Dawn of Life, which is looking at the first first life on the planet up to the dinosaurs, and we're hoping, well, it will open later next year. And I'm curious about the geographic interest in material based on the downloads from the website, because we've seen that there's a huge interest in critters, especially in Japan. There have been documentaries talk about it, merchandise, and so on. So where's it coming from in terms of the downloads of the provided?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have that data to hand, I'm afraid. I know that we had a lot of interest from the US and Canada and China and India for some of the virtual events that we put on. So whether that drove some of the traffic, but it would be really interesting to find out where these downloads. I'm not sure whether we have that data, or I'll have to speak to my colleagues and find out more, but I'll definitely do that.
We have a couple of questions for Esben. Our friend Anita Hammerstedt has suggesting that she sees a connection to H.R. Grieger and Alien. Whether you could talk a little bit about popular arts as a source of inspiration for scientific models. How this also connects into questions in the last session.
Esben, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I'm on now. So, yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. We are. I mean, when we get the supervision for scientists, we get the Bauplan, we get the anatomy details and so on. But there's always a lot of, the feel of how you make models look like real animals instead of dead models. And of course, the movie industry are experts in this. So also when we are making color schemes, of course, now we know a little more about colors and feathers and these things. But many of the models we make, for example, the big Archelon we are making right now, the turtle, I mean, nobody knows what color it had. So we are looking, of course, into present marine turtles, but also looking to Alien and all these great craftsmen that are good at painting great color schemes. So we feel very much in family with these guys.
Thank you. If I may follow up quickly, I mean, how long does it take to create some of these models? Of the time involved?
It takes a long time. Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to say because we're always working on lots of models at the same time. You might expect that the small models are quicker than the big one, but it's not always the fact because we're paying so much attention and building them up from inside out, putting small hairs on one by one. But I mean, we are 3 people and it takes months to create the models.
So any museums on the call, take this into account if you're ordering.
Oh, you're falling out, sorry?
Any museums on the call, please take this into account when you're ordering.
Yeah.
We have another question for Duncan in the chat. Dennis Hansen is asking whether you have heard from people or visitors regarding your freely downloadable 3D models. Are they being used for any interesting purposes?
Yeah, so we haven't seen that much, but there was initially quite a lot of interest in the augmented reality, and we had lots of people, that were playing around with them from that respect. And very recently, a project was brought to our attention where somebody is making this interactive game, and they're trying to look at the evolution of oceans through time, and they're pulling together various free models, and they've used all, I think, virtually all of our models in that. So that will be freely available, and that's a project that's been led by a student. Actually, yeah, I think Imran's put some more details about it in the chat. So yeah, we are seeing people taking these and taking them forward in exciting ways.
Thank you. We have a question for Elaine in the chat from Elsa Panciaroli. Writes, we've been looking at artistic depictions from 100+ years ago in the first talk. right through to digital reconstructions in the last few years. Do you think the modern reconstructions have the same endurance? Will someone be discussing them in 150 years the same way we are discussing solars, etc.?
Well, definitely. I think we've seen the sheer amount of research that goes in these models today, the technology. So these models don't only tell us about the research that is going on at the moment, the status of knowledge we have about organisms, but it also captures all that, what is going on in society and culture, the cultural influences, knowledge about ecologies. I mean, this is something quite new, and I find really exciting about these new modeling of ancient organisms, because this is something, of course, that doesn't really feature that much in the 19th century. So I think it's really up to the institutions to record all this incredible knowledge that comes as a package with the models, and not let go of it, and not sort of regard models as something that is used for a purpose, say an exhibition or a display, and then we forget about it. Because let's be honest, it's a lot of data to store, but I think it's really, really important to store it. And I think, yes, we will and should be talking about these in 100 years' time, definitely.
Thank you. Following up on this quickly, you spoke about models as an integral part of knowledge creation, and that they're not a sideshow. What recommendations do you have for museums, how to deal with those models? Should we acquire them? What should we do with them?
You mean historical models?
Well, or recent models, because they will be historic the day after they were created.
Absolutely, I would, because I think model making has always been an integral part of what natural history museums do. So absolutely, I mean, there's so much part of the fabric. It's almost, there's a blind spot because they're so obvious. I mean, you could say even taxidermy is a type of modeling. You could even type specimens are a type of modeling. You could really, I mean, see that museums are machines almost of churning out copies or models, and how important they are in knowledge creation and the display then of knowledge. So yeah, absolutely.
We have a couple more questions in the chat. One from Thor0 for Esben. What experiences do you have with dust and dirt on the huge models and exhibitions?
Luckily, it's not my problem. It's it's a museum's problem. I mean, the small models are behind glass because they're so fragile. But the big models, we use very tough materials, and we use a very strong paint. So, I mean, it could be cleaned with water and soap. Alcohol is not a good idea because it might take off the paint. But I have visited some of my models in some museums, and especially when you turn the work light on, you can see that there's a layer of dust on them. But I mean, it can be taken away, and it should be. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a question from John Holmes, and that there's something in it for every one of you. He asks Esben and Duncan how much attention you pay to the early history of models, such as those discussed by Elaine. And Elaine, what happens to obsolete models once the science changes?
Well, if I could start, I mean, the Blaskas, Rudolf and Leopold Blaska are, I mean, they are the most fantastic model makers in the world, and I mean, they are kind of the standard we are trying to reach, and I'm afraid we haven't reached it yet. but yeah, we are looking very much at earlier models, and I'm working together with Palaeoart artists as John Sibbick, working together with him, and I take great inspiration in his, especially the way he can, the feel of the color schemes and so on.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, we tried to start first principles in with as many of them as possible, partly because lots of these organisms haven't received very much attention, particularly the ones from the Xinjiang. But we were also aware of trying to do something a little bit different and trying not to necessarily reuse existing sort of color schemes or ways of posing the organisms, and try and sort of approach it from the direct evidence, as it were. So it wasn't sort of directly in our minds, but I think it obviously informed a lot about the artist himself that was doing the reconstructions, more than us as the scientists would say.
Regarding the question about obsolete models, once the science changes, but I think this is when models become really exciting, because this is something that we can see, we can follow the history of the different stages in how we got to the point we are now, and to understand that this is also just a process. So I think we are just in a point where we will also progress from. So I think to tell this story in a museum, this is a wonderful opportunity to use these models, because they're so visual. I mean, they were meant to communicate. They're the ultimate science communicators. So to use these models, I think, and this is, I mean, weird and wonderful stories like the different, the speculation about the posture of the various dinosaurs, and the intricacies of the feathers of the Archaeopteryx and how this has changed. I mean, you could tell a whole story just about the color of the feathers of the Archaeopteryx by using these taxidermy models. So I think they are a real opportunity, and I think where these models are still present in museum collections, they should absolutely be used and not be left to gather dust somewhere or thrown out, like unfortunately is often the case.
Yeah, and I would just add that we had, in terms of obsolete models, there were at least 2 of the organisms that we featured. Papers were published during the process that we were doing the reconstruction, and we had to have discussions about how up to date we are able to actually be if during the life of the exhibition the science actually changes. So it was really exciting from that respect, but it's also, you have to sort of make that decision at some point.
So I see no more questions in the chat. And I think then that would be then a wrap for today. I'd like to thank our speakers for 3 really great talks, and also thank the audience for attending the session and sticking around with us for the day. Please do join us for the final session on Friday on the Anthropocene and the Arts and Natural History Museum. Please sign up for this. And thank you again from me, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And a final reminder that an email will go out shortly requesting your feedback. So please do respond to that email, because we'd like to have your feedback to shape future events put on by the Symbiosis Network. And very much look forward to seeing you on Friday.
Thank you. Bye.